There's the turn of phrase, there's the feel of it, the kind of the motif, whatever it might be, just gets a hold of you and you're like, well, I'll be whistling that tune for the rest of the day. I was tearing across town with my daughter, and we got to the school and everybody was gone. As I'm doing this kind of like, I hate to say it, but banjo music's going through my head, and this tune is just kind of forming in there.
Your background was in punk rock and rock and roll and the blues, so
right,
making the transition to Celtic music was a bit of a later in life kind of journey, eh?
Well, it was predicated on Kate doing this. I mean, like I said, I'd always heard, bands like the Pogues or the Waterboys and things. It always made a lot of sense to me, but I'd never gone deep on the traditional music and really kind of what was there. I mean, I have a background in the music industry and had worked in record stores, so I kind of knew there was stuff out there and I'd heard some of it, but I'd never really gone deep on it. And it was an amazing experience. And and rock and blues and all those that's all folk music too. So I mean, they do in many ways come from the same place. So it's not that big a jump. And if you think about players like Jimmy Page, I mean, he really based a lot of what he did on a lot of that traditional music. And so it kind of all comes from the same feel ultimately.
Errol, you have a bigger background with the fiddle. You've toured with some pretty well-known musicians. You can tell us a bit about that, but tell me where you get the material from that goes in, because there's hundreds and hundreds of jigs and songs from the Celtic tradition. How do you thousands exactly?
Thousands.
So how do you decide what to put in your repertoire?
You have to play the tune, and it has to speak to you. There's a lot of tunes out there that you'll play once and you're like, oh, that's nice, and I'll probably never play it again. But then you'll come across this one that's just, it just grabs you. There's something about it. There's the turn of phrase, there's the feel of it, the kind of the motif, whatever it might be, just gets a hold of you, and you're like, well, I'll be whistling that tune for the rest of the day, or I'll be, it'll be on my mind. So they kind of come to you rather than the other way around. You go sorting through a lot of them, but they kind of jump out at you. And a lot of them that we play have kind of come through various other connections in music. Like, I started touring when I was 12. I went to Scotland with a group called the Calgary Fiddlers, and we did an incredible number of shows, but we got to meet a lot of great traditional musicians, primarily Scottish musicians at that point. And so we picked up tunes when we went. We were, this whole group of fiddle players, and so we'd show up at a session, and it was kind of a bit of a novelty, and so they'd let us all sit in, and we'd pick up the tunes and we'd take them home. And so there's a number of the pieces that we play that have kind of come from that I've collected over the years, and they stick. And if it's a good tune, it sticks.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and then as I mentioned earlier too, once we started to play together, and because we weren't really thinking about being a band, we were just friends, and the kids were friends, and it was just lovely to have this music in our house. I really, truly beautiful, actually. And I just felt so lucky when this started to happen. But we really explored through all of these tune books. And there was the one, I always think of this one in particular from Kingston, Ontario, interestingly, from the Harpatara, which is a pub there. And they organized this unbelievable collection of songs with a lot of the history. And so, we'd often find a tune that we'd like to play together, and, we'd certainly, like Errol said, it would kind of stick, and then we'd read the backstory and we'd go, wow, that's an amazing story that's behind the music too. So it's like, that kind of added a new dimension to it. But we still do that. I mean, we just did this 2 days ago, right? We get together and we explored the tune books, and we were looking for some new Scottish stuff, actually, for Robbie Burns Day. And we threw out a few, and we found a handful that we think sound great, and some that we'd played before and hadn't actually got back to. And so now, because we've been together for 6+ years, and I just think the connection's really strong, that we kind of know if it's gonna click or not, right? So,
yeah. Now, Miriam, your instrument's the piano, but piano is hard to lug around. You've got some skills on the accordion, so tell us about that, because I think you've performed some of the accordion songs on the album.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way that was the COVID and the local love deliveries too. I couldn't drag a piano around, so it was a very quick. I had kind of started playing a little bit. I'd been gifted an old accordion, and I had just gotten an actual better one that was in tune, and so that was my practice, was
Started with the kids' accordion.
On the sidewalk in front of people's houses. So it was a steep learning curve, and I'm still learning. But it's been really fun. Just
it adds a whole
different sound than the piano.
Yeah, because it swells so nicely. I mean, that was when we were playing around with Greystones, and you started on piano, and then when you switched over and were like, well, what if I did on accordion? All of a sudden it had this swell, and it sort of did tweak that moment. It has a sort of orchestral feel because it can have all that emotion to it.
Yeah, exactly.
It adds a drone note, and there's an instrument in traditional Irish music, the uilleann pipes, which is you basically squeeze it with one arm and then
Strangling a cat.
strangling a cat, or wrestling an octopus, whatever you want to call it. Very, very challenging instrument, and it has drones on it. And Miriam's accordion adds that layer, and it's just it works beautifully with the melody instruments, and so yeah.
Well, let's talk about the next number, The Old Grove, which you arranged, which you composed, actually. So tell us about The Old Grove and what we're going to hear next.
Yeah, so I guess while we're talking about instruments, there's one instrument we've left out here. And it is
That's
also...
not on purpose, is it?
No, it might be.
We just end here.
Exactly. So, like Pete's saying, the guitar is relatively new to Irish music, and the banjo is also relatively new to Irish music. And actually, the Irish kind of picked it up off the Americans, if you will, and brought it back to the Irish traditional music scene. Now, it's not like a mountain banjo, is 5 strings typically, tuned a specific way. In Irish music, you tend to play an Irish tenor banjo, which is tuned the same as a fiddle. But it gives you that great attack and a great sound. And Miriam and I were over in Ireland, and we popped up to Galway and stopped in and at this great banjo shop and I got myself a clarine banjo, which is I was kind of saving up for quite a while, and it was kind of a goal of mine. And so anyways, I had this banjo, and I was really getting to know it, and anyways, was taking the kids to school one day, and my daughter had a special field trip, and I'm not always the best at being on time. I try, but it doesn't always work for me. So anyways, I was running a little behind that day, and so I was tearing across town with my daughter, and we got to the school, and everybody was gone, and so it was this like race to go chase down her school group so that I could get her off and launched on this little field trip. And as I'm doing this kind of like, I hate to say it, but banjo music's going through my head, and this tune is kind of forming in there. And so anyways, I got my daughter, to the rest of the group there, and they went off to do their thing, and I got home, and I was like, I got to write this out. So I sat down and charted it all out. Took, I don't know, maybe half an hour by the time it was all said and done to just put it to paper, and because it was just stuck in my head. And I'm like, I gotta exercise my demons, get this thing out. And so that's where this tune came from, and it kind of, for me, it's evocative of that racing across town, and that there's kind of the highs and the lows of the whole adventure of this, what was actually a 5-minute trip in my minivan. But
and it's called the Old Grove.
Yeah, and it's called the Old Grove because the field trip she was going on was to the Old Grove here in Stratford. So.